I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1729er of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran, along with none other than that renowned history professor from the Duquesne University up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Dr. Robert M. Rodrigues. In this episode, he has reached the end of the tunnel in talking about the Vietnam War. He has covered the Vietnam War era from start to finish and all points in between, starting with the Trung Sisters in 44 BC, all the way up to the Mayaguez incident off the coast of Cambodia in 1975. He's done it all, and he's done a masterful job doing it. I, for one, greatly appreciate it. I encourage you to recommend his presentations on this podcast to everybody you know, because we need to know about our history so that we do not repeat the mistakes made in the past. It is so easy to forget about our history when we're thinking about all the current events going on and what may happen in the future. We have to know about what happened in the past. Otherwise, we'll be driving without any headlights into the darkness of the future. We need to shed light on where we're going based on where we've been. Dr. Rodrigues has laid it all out for you, and now it is your responsibility to tell everybody you know about it. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bob, and he is going to tell you about the end of the tunnel and the legacies the Vietnam War has left with us. Dr. Bob, you've got the microphone. Go for it.
Hi, Mac. Good to be back. This will be our final podcast of the Vietnam era that we've looked at over the past few weeks. I call this the end of the tunnel because Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker in 1967, when the United States launched the Success Campaign, hoping that they could bring an end to the Vietnam War with the positive statements of General William Westmoreland, Bunker, President of the United States Lyndon Johnson, and many of his advisors as well. But Ellsworth Bunker used the phrase, the light at the end of the tunnel. Well, this is the end of the tunnel, and it's not quite the end that the United States wanted. On January 27th of 1973, I think we mentioned that the Paris Peace Accords are signed, and the two main signers of that document were Lee Duc-Tho of the North Vietnamese and Henry Kissinger, who was our Secretary of State at the time. Also, at the same time, on January 27th, it was announced that the draft was ended. No more of the draft, and we have not resumed with the draft since then. I know in talking to a lot of the vets, they do feel that people should give their country at least 1 or maybe 2 years service. It doesn't have to be in the military, but some means of service. But nevertheless, that's an issue that I guess we'll address in the future. On March 29th, the last American combat troops are going to leave Vietnam, but the support staff is going to stay in place. On August 14th, this is again 1973, the last U.S. bombing of Cambodia takes place. This was an attempt to soften up the enemy so that the South Vietnamese government and the ARVN could hold their independence and hold their land as well. We mentioned that Richard Nixon had a lot of difficulty because of the Watergate scandals, and on May the 9th of 1974, impeachment hearings begin against President Richard Nixon. By August, Nixon is going to resign the office of the presidency in the face of most likely an impeachment and removal from office. Vice President Gerald Ford is going to take over as President of the United States. Now, what's interesting about this is President Ford was the only man to serve in the White House who was not elected by the American people. Remember that Nixon had run with Spiro Agnew. Agnew had his difficulties, and he had stepped down, and Richard Nixon nominated Gerald Ford in Spiro Agnew's place. And then, of course, when Nixon steps down, Ford will succeed to the presidency, and he will name Nelson Rockefeller as his vice president. So for 2 years, the American public had a president who was not elected by them, but did serve in office. So now we come to the fateful year of 1975. Things are not going well for the South Vietnamese and the ARVN. They've lost a lot of the American air support and a lot of the overall support of Vietnam, because by now, Americans had almost turned their back on Vietnam. Vietnam was in the past. Gerald Ford delivered a speech, I believe it was University of Michigan, and he said, well, that's over. We have to move on. Bui Diem, who was the American ambassador to the United States from Vietnam, went into Washington, to plead for help. And he said there was no one to talk to. People had evacuated, gone to different vacation spots, but really were in avoidance. By April 30th, the United States is going to evacuate any of the South Vietnamese who are in direct danger of being executed by the North Vietnamese, as well as American support troops. There is a very famous picture of a helicopter on top of the assistant or deputy ambassador's residence, and a ladder going up and people in a queue and a man leaning over helping them up. That's the helicopter pilot O.B. Harnish, and that picture was snapped at the right moment, and in a lot of ways it reflected the American leaving Vietnam and people climbing that ladder in desperation. The North Vietnamese are going to come in and take over Saigon. Interestingly enough, the final man to hold the office of the presidency of South Vietnam was Duong Van Minh, Big Min. And he was the man who launched the execution of Ngo Dinh Diem 12 years earlier, almost 12 years earlier. When he approached his North Vietnamese enemies, he says, I am prepared to turn over the government of South Vietnam. And the North Vietnamese response was, you cannot give up something that you do not have. And that was the final nail in the coffin for South Vietnam, the ARVN, and Saigon. The war officially ended then, but there was an incident that occurred almost 2 weeks later, which is associated with the war. And this was May 12th. The SS Mayaguez, which was an American merchant ship, was seized off the coast of Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge were a communist group that took over in Cambodia and seized the Mayaguez, and we believe had taken the hostages, the people on the Mayaguez, to Koh Tong Island off the coast of Cambodia. The United States launched a fierce attack of the island, and it was held off by the Cambodians. And unfortunately, there was a 3-man machine gun crew, Marines, who were left on the island in the quick retreat that was occurring. And these three men were Gary Hall, Danny Marshall, and Joseph Hargrove. They are all executed by the Khmer Rouge, Cambodians, and there were attempts to try to rescue them, and the Khmer Rouge would not allow them, the Marines, to come onto the island to retrieve any of their lost Marines. So Danny, Gary, and Joseph were considered MIA. Their bodies and their whereabouts were discovered in 1999, a lot later, when one of the Cambodians who was involved in the Kotong Island affair came forth and told the story of Hall and Marshall and Hargrove. They are the last three names on the Vietnam Wall. They are on the west panel at the very bottom at the apex of the wall. The postscript is 1976 to 1982, and that's Jimmy Carter is the next president. He's going to defeat Gerald Ford in the 1976 election. He is going to pardon more than 10,000 draft resistors who had fled to Canada and some other countries during the Vietnam conflict. Pol Pot of the Khmer Rouge of Cambodia is going to launch his killing fields in Cambodia. By 1979, the United Vietnam, the entire Vietnam, will invade Cambodia and set up a puppet government. So the war continued for the Cambodians. I think finally we know that the Vietnam Memorial Wall is dedicated in Washington, D.C. on November 11th, 1982. And this was the brainchild of Jan Scruggs, who served in Vietnam. I had the pleasure of meeting Jan a number of times, and he was extremely committed to the building of the wall, and I would see him down there oftentimes walking along the wall and picking up items that were left there. They were put into a hangar. For a while, there was a display of them in the Smithsonian, but then was to be moved to a museum underneath the wall, but that has been held up. Okay, that brings us to a close of the Vietnam War, and it calls into question, of course, American involvement in Vietnam, and it was a sad ending. Many of the last Americans to leave Vietnam spoke poignantly of what they called the betrayal of Vietnam. Many of them came back and expected to be debriefed and all, but they weren't. It was as if everybody just wanted to forget this war. Mac, I'm going to take you into some of the legacies of the Vietnam conflict. The first is the wall itself. The wall is a legacy. It is built there in Washington, D.C. because of the Vietnam conflict. The architect, Maya Lin, of the wall, referred to it as a meeting place, quote, between the sunny world, quiet, dark world beyond that we can't enter. Interestingly enough, as you stand in front of the wall, you can see your image in the marble, and the wall has a decline into the ground, and of course the black surface with the engravings on them. As of today, it is 58,276 names on the wall after they did an inventory last spring. Generally in May is when they add any others who may have been found, or maybe somebody who died from their wounds and it's verified that that is so. That is becoming less and less in recent years. I don't believe they added anybody last year. They did add a number of names the year before. So they will be inscribed in May, and they will be dedicated on Memorial Day. Now, of course, with the current pandemic, I'm not sure what the plans are. The second legacy, I think, are the vets. The men who fought in World War II or Korea could be just as haunted by what they had personally seen and done in combat. But they didn't come home, as the Vietnam vets did, to a country that was torn and full of doubt about why these wars were fought. And we know the story of Vietnam vet in return was not a happy one. They were considered, in some cases, baby killers, killers of innocent women and children. The third legacy I offer is the generation itself. For the most part, the legacy of one of the legacies of Vietnam era was moral confusion. There were young men who faced the dilemma of being drafted to fight in a war they opposed. There were young people who felt it was their duty to serve their country. There were young men who had no means to avoid the draft and would have if they had the means, and this would be to go to college or to get a medical deferment or something of that nature. I think there's also the defiant youth who not only changed their lives but changed American politics forever. So that generation. Now, we know the generation and the vets are nearing age, and they're in their late 60s, 70s, 80s, perhaps some in the 90s as well. The next legacy offers the armed forces, and this really comes out of my discussions with so many of the Vietnam veterans, and they refer to the growing segregation of our all-volunteer military from wider society. Opinion polls reflect this in some way. The offhand remark, quote, "thank you for your service," symbolizes distance. This is in their words. Reintegrating returning warriors remains profoundly important after the indifference and the hostility that the Vietnam vets faced in the 1970s. So, but there's a distance. In other words, the armed forces is an occupation, whereas back during the Vietnam era, you could be drafted and therefore lived amongst the people. So that is an observation that they have come out with, and I wanted to include. The last one I'm going to list is the music. The convergence of culture and protest is going to leave a very heavy legacy, which still lives on. It stamped an indelible mark of rebellion as the rock music scene, and it was the origin of some of the culture wars that existed and in many cases still exist today. Not everyone was a protester. There were cultural strands which did not embrace protest, such as country music, but in many ways they deeply resented the dominance of the protest music that occurred in the 60s and the 70s. And in some cases, this still has resonance in the structure of politics today. In talking with you, Mac, you offered up to the Agent Orange, and that's a leftover, certainly. Many of our soldiers who fought in Vietnam were exposed to the defoliant Agent Orange. This has caused, in some cases, cancer and deformed children on their part, and there are, of course, parts of Vietnam that are still have Agent Orange in the ground, and a loss to the Vietnamese people who live around there because some of their babies are born deformed. And I'm certain that your listeners can add more and more legacies. In fact, it might be a neat exercise and say, okay, well, this we can add and so on. So that brings to a close, I think, the Vietnam era podcast. I was very delighted and honored, very much honored to be able to do this and to spread some information to a lot of the listeners and to you, Mac. And Mac, you have been a very cordial, courteous host, and I can't say enough about you, Mac Payne. I appreciate all your efforts, and I appreciate you. Thanks, Mac.
Well, you are awfully kind to say that, and I have to say the same thing about you. I am so appreciative that you came on and shared with us your wealth of knowledge about the Vietnam War. Most Vietnam veterans didn't have the depth of knowledge about the overall picture that you've given us, and I just can't say enough how much I appreciate it. And I want to say one thing here to you and everybody else. I'm going to make a contribution to the Robert M. Rodrigues Fund that does all sorts of wonderful things, and I am encouraging everyone here to make a donation. $5, $10, $100, or even $1,000 would be greatly appreciated, because I know I've spoken to Mr. Cooper, who runs it, and he tells me about all the wonderful things you do. So I encourage everybody to make a contribution just to show our appreciation for what you've done for this podcast. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mac. That is very generous of you, and I appreciate the appeal to your listeners. I feel honored that the fund does some good things, community, and with young people who sometimes just need a boost in life to reach their full potential. So again, Mac, I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
That was Dr. Bob Rodrigues closing out the end of the tunnel of the Vietnam era story. Again, I appreciate so much that he took the time out of his busy schedule during this COVID-19 lockdown period to tell us all about the Vietnam War. You may or may not realize this. He shared his entire college course about the history of the Vietnam War. You've got it at no cost. If you went up there to Duquesne University, it would cost you thousands of dollars to receive the information that you got right here on this podcast. So appreciate it by sharing it with others, please. It is so important that this country understands what happened in the Vietnam War, how it got started, and how it ended. We do not want that to happen again. Just keep telling everybody about it. We do not ever again want to have a new memorial built in Washington, D.C. with 58,276 names etched upon its black marble surface. We can avoid that by learning as much as we can about the Vietnam War and other wars and making sure it does not happen again. I can tell you from personal experience, it is no fun sending a son off to fight in a war in a foreign land. We'd like to avoid that as much as possible. Dr. Bob Rodrigues has done a great job in helping to spread the word about that war. So hopefully we can move ahead into the future on a smarter path. Thank you again, Dr. Bob. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1729 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for coming to listen to these presentations. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?